RG has published and quoted in numerous sources, things like CTV, Global News, Financial Post, Reuters, so all kind of mediums. RJ also spoken and paneled at Sector and also sit at Thomson Reuters panel, so all those premier conference. And he is the editor of Canadian Cybersecurity 2018 and 2020. So if you want to know what's happening in the cybersecurity field, RJ is a go-to person for the thought leadership. And for today's topic, for the IoT security, he will talk about unpatched, unprepared, unprotected, how IoT vulnerability remains unaddressed. So let's welcome RG Sood.
And so before getting in there, I just wanted to kind of deliver a quick state of the union, right? A quick what's what, right, on IoT and the general state of the union with respect to cybersecurity as it pertains to the Internet of Things. As Brian mentioned, I am the regional vice president of Armis here in Canada. And what we do at Armis is we basically empower our clients to detect and defend devices that they would otherwise not be able to detect nor defend. We call these devices unagentable devices. So just think of all the stuff that you have that supports you in your personal life. A lot of companies and industrial manufacturers and healthcare, as well as banking and insurance, they all have a bunch of devices in or around their networks that could be a potential threat. So we're going to talk a little bit about high level what these threats look like. And we're going to drill into them, not at a very deep level, but at a high enough level so that you can be aware. And so the purpose of this session really is to generate questions inside. And what would be even better is if it generates questions outside. And so if you could, again, as Brian specified, turn to the chat, ask your questions. Brian will probably bring them to our attention later on. And of course, throughout the series of the panel, if you have anything you want to hear from the panelists, I'm more than happy to kind of take those questions to the front, okay? So that's me, and that's Armis, and that's what we do. And so let's jump into the material. So I've got a couple of sources that are all cited on any one of these charts. And one of the things I wanted to specify is the size of the problem. And so when you look at the year 2020, how could we forget that they are estimating that there's approximately 50 billion of these devices deployed worldwide. That is an awful amount of the general population of the planet. That's more than one-to-one mapping of devices to person. That's the first thing I'll say. And that's not too unbelievable, as a matter of fact. What's intriguing is as I sit here in my office in front of you, I have a one-to-one relationship with my laptop computer and a one-to-one relationship with my cell phone, which I use very frequently. But as I look around the room here, I've got a smart TV over there, I've got a digital assistant over there, I've got a motion sensor over there, I have an HVAC component over there, and all of these things are supporting my lifestyle. And I'm not even talking about my television, I'm not talking about the gaming consoles, I'm not talking about the tablets, I'm not talking about all of these things, and those are all unagentable. And they don't take a traditional security stack, the things that security professionals are very, very used to deploying in order to secure these said devices. And so add the size of the problem to a statement like this one. So this is extracted from the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity. The Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity is our national resource here in Canada for all things cyber, right? So if there's a threat, you contact them. If you need research, you contact them. If you need a statement on what's going on, you contact them. And so their statement on IoT or devices in general is that they have an intrinsic low degree of security. What does that mean? Very weak authentication, low, if any, encryption facility. And if they're connected to a cloud, low authentication, low security surrounding access to that information as well. Now, I don't even want to get into the governance and GRC side of things. I recall earlier on that Brian mentioned that there are some of our guests that are on the GRC side of things, governance, risk, and compliance. There's a ton of things that could go wrong in the cloud and when your data has been moved around the cloud without your consent, let alone your knowledge. And these are all part and parcel of the IoT experience. And so this has led to a couple of very, very interesting trends. And so obviously one that you've heard, ransomware being directed at a number of different organizations. If your organization has unfortunately been hit by ransomware, you understand its impact. And we've seen ransomware affect everything from healthcare to manufacturing to financial services, where folks will get onto these systems and lock them down. Well, IoT devices are being used to transmit as well as house ransomware, which is intriguing. On the healthcare side of the house, we've seen ransomware lock down healthcare facilities, unfortunately resulting in everything from loss of or degradation of patient care to loss of life, which is very, very tragic. And so all this has culminated in a general statement here in Canada stating that these devices are under siege. You need to be aware, you need to be alert, and you need to have countermeasures in place to protect your IoT devices. But how do you do that? These devices are everywhere. And the traditional security perimeter that we've all defined kind of has this harder outer shell and very, very soft middle. When we start looking at these devices, one of the things that they all share in common, so as I have my watch out here, is they're mobile, right? Second thing is they're designed to connect. Out of the box, they're speaking Wi-Fi. Out of the box, they're speaking Bluetooth. Out of the box, some of them are speaking protocols that we don't even understand. So I think of my security system at home that's using either Z-Wave or Zigbee. These are two non-Wi-Fi, but wireless protocols. And so when you have this many different types of devices from this many different kinds of manufacturers with this many different ways of managing them and or securing them, usually what ends up happening is you don't have a way to secure them. And so this explosion in not only the amount of devices, but in the types of devices has led to a very formidable attack surface that is diverse in nature. So you have many different types of appliances, you have many different locations, and again, these things move. So just in case you may have your finger on a device at one point in time, you don't know if your device is doing the right thing at the right time in the right place. And that is the challenge that IoT is facing or making us all face as security practitioners today. And so what I wanted to do was give you a couple of examples of the kinds of threats that you need to and should be aware of. This is not an exhaustive list of threats, but certainly it's a number of very prevalent threats that we at Armis have developed, or not developed, but rather developed countermeasures to and done research into. And so I want to take a moment and specify that this research that I'm presenting to you is certainly not my own, but it's the product of a number of researchers, not only here at Armis, but around the world. And I wanted to take a moment to credit all of these wonderful folks. So let's talk about CD-Pwn, right? CD-Pwn is a threat or a vulnerability that is synonymous with Cisco's CDP protocol or Cisco Discovery Protocol. This is a protocol that is enabled on many Cisco devices by default that is vulnerable, okay? And so it's about 5 different zero-day type vulnerabilities on the CDP protocol that impacts tens of millions of devices. So I want to think about your own environments, whether you be in a very large environment or a smaller one. Think about how many phones you have. Think about how many switches you have. Think about how many routers you have or firewalls or whatever the case may be. All of these devices are impacted. So I'm talking about 7,000, 8,000 series IP phones. I'm talking about the IP cameras, I'm talking about the switches, I'm talking about the routers, whatever the case may be. If you happen to have any of this stuff in your environment, which is highly likely, you are likely vulnerable. And so as an administrator of all these devices, which again can be in the tens, can be in the 20s, can be in the hundreds or the thousands, you need to be aware of what version of software is running on these particular pieces of technology and take steps in order to prevent you from being vulnerable to the CD-Pwn protocol. Well, what happens if CD-Pwn takes root in your environment? You could do a number of things. As an attacker, you can break network segmentation. So imagine I'm sitting on your switch and you've got your VLANs configured such that your IT network is over there and your trading network is over there and your medical network is over there and your robotics are all over there in very, very segregated zones. Well, I could literally use CD-Pwn to make that one big flat network where everything can talk to everything else. And I can then move from device to device to device. Breaking segmentation is pretty horrible. I could also break confidentiality. If I'm sitting on a switch, I can break SSL and potentially eavesdrop on traffic. If I'm sitting on a phone, I can listen to that phone conversation and now exfiltrate that as well. There's a lot of different kinds of attacks on confidentiality, integrity of data, as well as the availability of that data that you can launch with something like CD-Pwn. I want to move on to Urgent 11. Urgent 11 was also researched by Armis, and the reason it's called Urgent 11 is because it is a series of 11 critical zero-day vulnerabilities that attach to Wind River VXworks. What is Wind River VXworks? Well, if I were to ask you the question, what is the most populous operating system on the planet, as in what operating system are there more instances of worldwide than any other? People would sometimes guess maybe Windows, right? Because it's very, very common, or potentially a Linux or potentially a Mac OS, less on the Mac OS side. But actually, it's VXworks. Why? Because VXworks is the operating system. It's a real-time operating system that powers things. These things are generally speaking, let's talk about printers, let's talk about automobiles, let's talk about firewalls and other network devices. Almost all are running VXworks. Another classification of devices that runs VXworks in a very, very high fraction is medical devices. So now I want you to think of your IVs, your intravenous devices. I want you to think of your infusion pumps. I want you to think of your dialysis machines, all of which running VXworks. And that has found to be vulnerable. And so, without going into too much details, it allows an attacker to either locally or remotely take over this device. This device could be done on a wired internet connection or Ethernet connection. It could be done over a wireless Wi-Fi connection, and in certain cases, over Bluetooth as well. So all you need to do is be within range of a device that is vulnerable to Urgent 11 in order to be able to take over this device. So think of a patient monitor, think of an IV, think of a dialysis pump, think of an infusion pump for insulin for a diabetic. And you're very, very close to that person, or you're not so close. You're available to them over the network after you've broken network segmentation, say. You can gain complete control over that device and either start giving out false information, or you could even shut down the delivery of medicine, or worse, increase the delivery and mess with the dosages of medicines as well. And so the impacts of Urgent 11 are very, very high. Everything from being able to take over a printer on a local network and giving you a toehold in a corporate network, to potentially impacting life in a biomed/medical life sciences side of things. Now, I want to talk about Bleeding Bit as well. Bleeding Bit is an interesting one because it's a creepy/sneaky one. I know we're all in the mood for Halloween, so Bleeding Bit is going to be a great little conversation for us to have. And Bleeding Bit was a series of 2 critical vulnerabilities that enabled RCE, remote code execution, or full takeover of Bluetooth-enabled devices. So now we're not even talking about Wi-Fi. Now we're not even talking about TCP/IP. We're talking about good old-fashioned Bluetooth, specifically Bluetooth Low Energy, which is pretty much a chip manufactured by Texas Instruments, or TI, that is present in almost every application. Now, ubiquitously, we saw it in a lot of Wi-Fi access points, and we saw it in a lot of network-type devices, but it was also present in places like watches, also present in things like cell phones, anything that had a BLE chip manufactured by Texas Instruments. So how did you take advantage of, say, Bleeding Bit? Well, what you could basically do is that you could be in the airspace or the general vicinity of a vulnerable device. So in this case, if I happen to be parked in the lobby of a major office tower, for example, and there happens to be a BLE chip in an access point that's not too far from me, and let's just say that access point is in charge of maintaining 2 different networks. And we see this all the time. When you look at an enterprise wireless solution, more often than that, you'll have a corporate secure network and possibly a guest network for visitors and contractors running over the same physical hardware. It's just more efficient to do that. Well, leveraging the Bleeding Bit vulnerability, I can hop onto that device and flatten the network into one big network, which gives me access and a toehold in the network, which enables me then to begin the attack lifecycle. So I want to talk about the attack lifecycle for a second because it's important, right? So the first thing you do is you need an attack vector. So in this chart, you don't need to pay attention to the specific details, but sometimes it could be a spearfish, sometimes it could be a drive-by, sometimes it can be a cross-site script on the website. It doesn't matter. It's your initial attack, which gives you a malware download that then allows you to establish some form of persistence, right? Command and control, CNC, whatever the case may be, and then move laterally within the organization and then perform the damage. That can be crypto lock, that can be encrypt, that can be steal data, that can be eavesdrop, that can that we understand that malware life cycle or that attack life cycle. Because what we look at is we find MRI machines performing command and control. So there's your persistence. We found WannaCry in medical devices spreading across flat open networks where segmentation was either not present or defeated. We found infusion pumps that are compromised by malware while connected to patients. And of course, medical crash carts being used to access Facebook or other social networking type sites where malware can be delivered. And so these are all examples of different, so those 5 blocks that we saw in the previous chart, 5 examples, 5 different blocks of all these devices, these things, these IoTs, right, participating in these various components of an attack lifecycle. And so, again, talking to the size of the problem, this is some statistics that we were able to pull out of an average size company, I'll say that has approximately 10,000 users. In those 10,000 users, they found over 300,000 devices. 300,000 devices leveraging various different operating systems, varying across different components like computers, handhelds, network equipment, other and communications, IP phones. This is the size of the problem. This is the complexity of the problem. And this is the diversity of the problem. And you need to have resilience in place so that you can defeat problems like WannaCry. And so I end this segment of the presentation with this chart to highlight the waves of malware, right? So the cycles of malware that approach our modern industries across IoT. And I use this model deliberately because I want to signal the entrance of a very, very unfortunate circumstance that's in front of all of us right now. I want to start by saying, obviously, COVID-19 is a pretty horrific situation. And my heart goes out to everybody who's been affected by it, right? I mean, we've all heard about cases and we've heard about people being impacted and their health being impacted and the economy being impacted and people's livelihoods being impacted. This is a terrible and awful thing that has happened. That said, because this is a difficult time, right, we've also seen malware activity targeting organizations in relation to COVID-19. So here's a CSC statement from our government, Canadian government. The Communication Security Establishment has made a statement on threat activity targeting COVID-19 vaccine development specifically. So now we're talking about life sciences. Why? Well, if you estimate I call it the market cap, but really just the size of the business opportunity for a COVID vaccine, depending on what you charge for it, it's going to be somewhere between $10 to $30 billion. That's an awful lot of money. It's an awful lot of money for a patent. It's an awful lot of money for that research. And so what we're starting to see are some very, very formidable cyber actors who are engaged in malware campaigns directed to people who are doing research in COVID-19. Why do I make this point? Because I want to make this point to say that anybody can be a target. And so there's a news item here you can see at the bottom from the Globe. And the statement made is that there's a lack of appreciation within Canada that we are a very, very worthwhile target for adversaries. And this is a very, very real statement. And so I'll go to the top here where we talk about APT29. APT29, otherwise known as Cozy Bear. So whenever you hear a malware group's name or a gang's name with the name Bear in it, that's a naming convention to refer to a Russian malware developer or malware actors or threat actors. So APT29, we first ran across them probably about 6 years ago when they took out Hillary Clinton's, or when they broke into Hillary Clinton's campaign, the DNC, the Democratic National Convention, by spearphishing John Podesta, who at the time was her campaign manager. The same organization that was charged with political hacktivism, or whatever you want to call it, is now after COVID-19 formulas. And I want to be very, very clear. These folks are formidable. They're fantastic malware authors. They're fantastic hackers. APT29 is nothing to be trifled with. And they are active now in Canada, the US, and the United Kingdom. I also wanted to kind of highlight the need for response, the need for resiliency, the need for preparedness. I have a couple of items here that I wanted to kind of present for your consideration. One from the University of Guelph saying that response to an attack, right, is very, very important. It's very, very relevant. And to have an advisory council or to have a platform or to have a process or to have a statement ready as it pertains to the attack surface is extraordinarily relevant. Earlier on in this presentation, we talked about the number of IoT devices that would be adjacent to or somewhere relevant to your network. That's an extraordinary part of the attack surface. And that's why we're here talking IoT and IoT security today. The other item I wanted to present was from Harjit Sajjan's Twitter. And so I took care to actually snip Harjit Sajjan's Twitter and not just the CSC Twitter. Harjit Sajjan, for those of you who don't know, is our Minister of Defense. This is the tank, bomb, and gun guy, okay, who is looking after munitions and wars and espionage and all that good stuff. That's his responsibility to maintain the national security and safety of our country. And here, our Minister of Defense is making a very bold statement about malware and CSE, saying that it's important to defend, in this case, healthcare organizations, our national interests, and those of our allies in the UK and the USA. Let's call out bad behavior, reinforce shared and common understanding of rules-based norms, and deter malicious foreign cyber actors from targeting our country. In effect, what Harjit Sajjan is saying is that it's our responsibility collectively to make sure that we are resilient under threat in order to protect national security. And so I will close and conclude by one saying, again, always grateful, always thankful to be in such excellent company, starting again with Brian and certainly my co-panelists, Andreas and Nick Job. More than happy to continue the discussion, but I want to close with three critical questions. And I know Brian will tell you that I'm very, very interested in asking good questions. And so when it pertains specifically to IoT or to devices in general, understanding what you have is key. And not only understanding what you have every month, every year, every quarter, but what do you have all the time? And what is it doing? Why do I care? Right? Okay, I have a bunch of stuff. Why do I care about these devices? What assets do they have? How are they communicating? To where are they communicating? What digital rights do they have? These are all very relevant questions. And then finally, what actions can I take on these devices? Can I contain them? Can I patch them? Do I know what state they're in? So ask good questions. And so other questions I always encourage, another trifecta of questions, are, if I was going to breach you, how would I do it? If I was going to breach you, how would you know? And finally, if I did get breached, what does that Armageddon look like? Right? What does that worst case scenario look like? And so for answers to those and other questions, I encourage you, as always, to reach out to me, to reach out to Brian, to reach out to your peers, start the conversation and keep the conversation moving.